I hope you see everything. Yes, good. So as you see on the screen, the topic of today is performing citizenship in post-1991 Ukraine. And a starting point for this inquiry was the question, what could be a proper conceptual lens to capture post-1991 developments in Ukraine in order to account for changing modes of popular participation? So in a nutshell, this is, first of all, this is a conceptual endeavor. So this is not that much about exposing some new facts or data, but more about the ways how they could be framed to make sense of what's going on or what has been going on, to move the shift, to move the focus of attention from political elites, usual suspects of political theory, more to the broader audience, to the citizenry of Ukraine. And here, two trigger points are of specific importance for me, as you might guess from the title already. This would be the Maidan uprising of 2013-14 and the elections of 2019, which supposedly established the audience democracy in Ukraine. So rather than treating them separately as just like episodes in Ukrainian contemporary politics, I'm trying to bring them together under the common theoretical umbrella. And I think that Reset is a very fitting venue for this endeavor, because I would really start with this more general thinking, general backdrop of post-Cold War developments. And from my perspective, current political transformations worldwide are very much defined by the tension between two contradictory tendencies. So on one hand, we have this growing distrust to political institutions, and which become less and less functional, so to speak, at least in the perception of the broader audience. And on the other hand, we have this growing urge for political participation on the side of the citizenry, or at least for its agency or will to be recognized. And these two trends, these two tendencies, they're kind of conflicting, and they create this special demand for new political configurations. And very often, this tension is captured with the buzzword of today, which is populism. But I believe that it's, first of all, it could be largely misleading in certain contexts, but also it perpetuates the fallacy of the institutionalist approach. And I will try to develop a slightly different approach today to discuss with you whether it is a plausible endeavor, all in all. So this is sort of the general backdrop, and now the specificity of Ukraine. So when we're talking about these largely distrusted and dysfunctional institutions, in Ukraine, they can be put in two separate baskets, largely. So on one hand, we have these vestiges of the Soviet institutional makeup that morphed into the contemporary shadow institutions of patronal politics, which are arguably efficient, but not too much tending to people's needs and interests. And on the other hand, we have these newly established democratic institutions that are largely hollowed out. And that's why Ukraine is oftentimes labeled as a safe or fragile democracy due to this fact. As for the urge for political participation, that was enhanced with several factors. One is a universal currency, which would be the rise of social media, which is a platform which flattens the political field, sort of neutralizes the gatekeepers, and creates this space for more sort of empowered political agency. But also there are some specific factors. One of them would be this growing social base of people who sort of stepped out of the shadow of the Soviet mentality and developed a different take on the political domain as such. This rising middle class, quite well integrated in international networks, be that entrepreneurial or academic, and they create the demand for a different type of relationship between the power holders and the populace at large. And also, of course, the success cases of disrupting the order, these multiple Maidans, which were a few in the Ukrainian history, recent history. Okay, so the main hypothesis, the proposal that I'm bringing on the table today is that the political domain in Ukraine is essentially performative. So I'm suggesting the conceptual toolkit of the performative theory to apply to the Ukrainian politics. And I'm arguing that it plays the first hand while the institutional and functional aspects are derivative from it. So when I'm saying performative, I need to make several disclaimers here, because of course, those who have observed Ukrainian politics, at least to some extent, you know that there are quite many vivid performances in public politics. You see some examples, you might recognize some of them. So all these performances, they could be acted out by established politicians, officials, or let's say random people taking the stage. There are quite many of them, but that's not exactly the focus of my attention today, because I tend to interpret performances not just like something of secondary importance, like illustrations of power generated elsewhere, entertaining the audience in a certain way, or even being a small screen that sort of shifts attention from like the real power sides. What I do instead, that I'm arguing that the performative approach to politics is an alternative to the institutionalist approach, because the institutionalist approach is focusing on the functionality of institutions, obviously, and institutions by their nature, they are depersonalized and predictable. So you can expect some predictable outcomes disregarding people entering the institution or claiming some service from it. What the performative politics implies instead is a highly personalized politics, very actor-centered. So the outcome always depends on the concrete person in charge. And the ultimate example would be probably the scope of presidential capacities depending on the concrete person in the office. As you might know, with every change of the incumbent after every presidential elections, we have some constitutional changes defining the functions of this position. But it also, it is valid for all sides and facets of politics, even in the islands of dissent, even in the opposition. So it's always centered with personalities. In the second instance, it is action-oriented. Both the politicians, established politicians and oppositions are prone to ad hoc solutions, one-off actions. So rather than following the established procedures, it's always about some precedents, some attempts to make some claim or change the game, so to speak. And if it gets validated, it can lead to a certain more or less rooted or established practice. So I call it the politics of validated precedents. And of course, since we're talking about performativity, it is usually validated by the audience. The question is to define this audience. So where is the audience in every specific instance? Another important point is that emotional prevails over rational. If we are entering the domain of performative politics, then it's not that much about rational deliberations, about certain points and issues, about certain policies, but it's more about mobilizing emotions and political effects, whether of negative or positive character, and that brings political capital far more fast and efficient. And the last point here would be perspectivism that prevail over certain universal values. So it's not immoral per se, but rather it's sort of not even relativist, but it's more about upholding a certain hierarchy of values, which is relevant for a specific social group the actor is part and parcel of or claims to represent. And these performative politics define a very different political architectonic, a very different structure of the political field, which unfolds on two levels. The first one, the basic one, is the actor and the audience that enter the core constitutive relations with one another. Once we have a political actor, whether an individual or a collective one, which makes an action, makes a power claim, then he or she needs to connect with the audience, and the audience recognizes the political character of this action by watching this spectacle, by agreeing to observe it. So that's first sort of the binary logic. So it's not about discussing or disqualifying or looking for arguments discrediting the claim, but it's either entering the spectator or withdrawing from it. And then the audience itself, well, first of all, it can be multiple, and then it complicates the whole structure. But In the first approximation, the audience could be bound to its seat, sort of obliged to watch the spectator, as in the theater state, the Geertz notion, right? Or it can be have the right to passive resistance, just stand up and leave, metaphorically, this political theory, or even active resistance, moving the stage elsewhere, transforming into the act itself what exactly happened on the Maidan. And the second level, sort of the supplementary, which is also important because it creates the whole political setup. It is the stage, the material condition, what is called the props in the theater, and the connection between the actor and the audience provided by the media. So these are the main elements to be accounted for if we want to treat this scheme seriously. So the research questions: how has the political agency of Ukrainian people been performatively established? What modes or regimes of citizenship were enacted and brought into play with one another? And how did these rearrange the political domain? So the outline of today's speech would be the introductory part you have already heard, some theoretical premises I'm starting from. Then I would briefly describe the pretext, the patronal politics in 1990s, then the Maidan as the manifestation of performative citizenship, and I will give you a piece of theory in that part as well. The third part would be the emergence of ocular democracy and the manifestation of the citizen-spectator as a new regime of citizenship, and some concluding remarks. Okay, so the first part, as was already mentioned, the political institutions in 1990s fall into categories: facade democratic institutions and shadow patronal institutions. And it turns out that democratic institutions are democratic in name only, in terms of poorly performing the declared functions, while patronal institutions are mostly functioning to facilitate state capture and state wealth redistribution among narrow circles of kleptocratic elites. There is a certain degree of performativity here, but it is quite limited. It is of secondary, so it's not that much about generating new type of political agency, but rather it's sort of playing in this political theory. And I can redirect you to Wilson's research in virtual politics, where he quite aptly describes all this political advertisement and other phenomena quite relevant in the context. But since we are focusing on citizenship today, so here it is citizenship on paper, so to speak. According to the constitution of Ukraine, indeed, the Ukrainian people are the main sovereign and the source of power, but in fact, in real politics, that is circumscribed citizenship. It is a disempowered citizen being governed and just occasional citizen voter, where voting does not bring about the desired changes. There are quite many research on that matter. Here, I give you a quote from Kudelia, who labels Ukraine an incomplete state that fails to perform its duties. We can also think of Stephen Holb's notion of Potemkin democracy, and where he says that a democratic citizen is much more than a newspaper reader and an occasional voter, and so on and so on. But I do like this quite ironic formulation by Chimaglu and Robinson when they describe this cluster of states that they call paper leviathans, or those who do not perform their duties properly. They call them an Article 15 state. So supposedly all these states, their constitutions, they can include this Article 15, which is fend for yourself. So basically people are left alone. They are not being properly taken care of by state institutions. So they are not citizens with rights, but they are rather patients of the state who may or may not be tended to. Quite a gloomy picture, right? So that was the pre-context when the Maidan happened. Again, there were several of them, but and they were like subsequent stages of this unfolding performative citizenship. And I believe on this logic, it was about the expanding social base of this active performative citizenship. There are many research focus on diverse aspects of the Maidan uprising. Some of them focus on the fact that it is a type of body politics or street politics. So basically the main modus operandi is to occupy public spaces physically, to take to the streets, to become publicly visible. Sort of, we're here and we are not okay with what's going on. And you see to the left this poster saying that basically we're fed up and we do not want to beg anymore from corrupt politicians, but we want to take something that belongs to us by the Constitution, right? So that's sort of the first aspect. The second one is focusing on this carnivalesque character, that it's almost not like a real protest, but more like a festivity, a sort of communal ritual, which created a burst of creativity, which was already, of course, there, but not only that. I argue that it is also durable, kind of long-standing collective performative action that was aimed to claim for political rights, and by doing so, by the same token, constituted the political agency. So the promised piece of theory from the publication by Isin from the Oxford Handbook of Citizenship, he suggests an interesting notion of performative citizenship, which I find quite fruitful for making sense of the Ukrainian developments. So in a nutshell, the idea is that in some settings, people do not have rights by default. And in this case, it transforms our understandings of the essence of citizenship. So he says, okay, if we focus just on legal and political institutions, we fail to see how people actually perform citizenship, despite the existing configuration and institutional setup. So like Hannah Arendt said, that citizenship is the right to have rights. And Isin says that it's actually the right to claim rights, because in certain settings, it implies a political struggle to acquire these rights, to contest and to construct citizenship. When people break through this ascribed, often precarious position and claim for citizenship and thus enact it. Again, quote unquote, by acting like citizens, they make a performative claim to citizenship. And to make sense of this theoretically, I'm grounding on speech acts theory by Austin and its reading by Judith Butler. So as you all remember, Austin distinguishes between different types of speech acts. For instance, if I say it's a pen, I'm just like referring to some existing objective reality, right? But if I'm saying I decline this offer, then I'm generating something in the act, not describing post factum something already pre-existing. So in political field, it is the same. Sometimes performances are just illustrating the political facts, agency, and claims that existed before, but sometimes they are performative in the sense that they instantiate a new reality by the token of making this performance, by the token of making this action. So that's sort of the reading of political performativity, which is at play in this research. What was the audience? As you remember, it's one of the structural elements, the key elements of the political field. In the first place, these were domestic power holders. That basically was the main addressee taken to the streets and making some claims were fed up. Later on, it was also compatriots, fellow citizens who did not do that for whatever reasons and stayed at home in front of the screens, but sort of continued watching the spectator or this performance, trying to persuade them that either we are basically representing you or we are in this together or we're sharing some common ground, whatever the claim is, to entangle them, to bring them on our sort of political side, but also international audience. And I believe all the three were quite important in the process. My apologies for this violent picture, but it illustrates even a little bit brutally the point I'm trying to make. If you remember the second level of second layer of the political structure, that media is crucial for connecting the actor and the audience. And if the actor is not established, if her position is not guaranteed by the institutional setup, then the media coverage is of paramount importance, because this creates the opportunity of these claims to be validated, right? And therefore, journalists become political actors, not just neutral observers. And therefore, they got targeted brutally by the riot police. Having said all that, I have to mention that, of course, the whole Maidan event was much more than just a performative action. And there were some important elements that fell out of the performative logic. It was not only a disruptive action, and it has to be mentioned here, right? So also these so-called Maidan camps, it stood as a quasi-model of an ideal society, because this quite diverse social structure tending for different needs of these improvised camps, it went far beyond the needs of just a protest movement. And also another element connected to the previous one was this sort of grassroots problem solving, this very low level, very pragmatic, tackling some urgent tasks and performing on them, which then rose to volunteer movement. I think these were the germs of alternative political action, which are quite important and oftentimes missed in this process. So the end point. The Maidan ended. Some activists got infiltrated in state institutions that were largely still of the facade character, and we were trying to fill them with real content to sort of counterweight, counterbalance shadow patronal institutions. However, the spectacle ended, the connection with the audience got disrupted, and it gave way to other performances. Some of them quite macabre, like the warfare in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, but nevertheless, so the shift of attention of the audience moved elsewhere, and the collective body, the collective actor of the Maidan got split. But some achievements were left, and I would name just two. The first one, indeed, this enlarged agency of Ukrainian citizens. That was a sort of citizen disruptor that wanted to become the citizen governor. I would say that it did not do so. However, some extended agency was recognized by the power holders. And secondly, the successful experience of grassroots problem solving, it remained, although often is sort of under the radar. The third point, the emergence of audience democracy. For me, it was manifested when Poroshenko replied, "Stadium may be the stadium." So that was sort of the shift in the usual mode of behavior during the electoral campaigns, when the debates were moved to the Olympic Stadium in Kyiv. That sort of started a new, let's say, stage, well, era, maybe it's too loud. It was a tipping point in any case in public politics in contemporary Ukraine. And what I see here, it was the changing model, the changing political imaginary. So you see these two pictures, they're similar, like at the first gaze, they're quite similar. You see the Maidan in the upper left corner and the Olympic Stadium in the bottom right. However, they visualize quite different political configuration. If the Maidan is tentatively a Greek agora, then the stadium would be a Roman forum. And that has a number of political implications, which we can discuss in the Q&A if you find it interesting. So seemingly, it was like a regular election. So it was not about people taking to the street. So who is the actor in this? Who makes performative claims here? Who establishes or constitutes political agency here? The stage is certain. So now the stage is not the central square, but it's TV and social media. The audience is mostly people in front of their screens, very diverse social makeup. But who's the actor? There are several versions here. For instance, quite well-known sociologist Yevhen Holovacha says that it is the Ukrainian people, that it was actually a grassroots counter-revolution against the failure of the Maidan to deliver what was expected. Others say that actually the real agency belongs to the oligarchs, the shadow puppet masters. They just recognized the people's request for a fresh face and found the proper candidate to satisfy this request. And some people say that, well, it was a political competition, and then a group of people around Vladimir Zelensky just managed to contingently win the power struggle. I would say that it's not that important from this perspective, although important in itself, of course, but I say that the answer is elsewhere, that actually the agency of the citizen-spectator became hegemonic. These people who were seemingly passively observing the performance in front of their screens, they suddenly acquired a certain agency. Their political power got recognized. As you remember from the beginning of this talk, is that it is about co-constitutive relationship. So the audience constitutes the actor by validating his claims. I will probably skip the Zelensky proposal, which is quite known, but I will move to this new, relatively empowered citizen spectator who felt empowered at least in three ways. One, quite importantly, the leader, Zelensky, stylistically mimicked the electorate in the rhetoric, in patterns of behavior. So people treated him as a mirror where they could recognize themselves. And he was trying quite successfully to sell this image. I'm one of us, I'm just a simple guy from Kryvyi. So it is the matter of political styles, which is quite important in performative politics. Then some chances of career mobility in line with the recent trend of digital parties was suggested that people could join the Z team with no entry requirements, and so they can join this political project and sort of partake in the governance. And thirdly, probably the most mass aspect here is that this newly generated citizen spectator was directly addressed and reported to in social media. What Nadia Urbinati calls disintermediation is precisely this direct communication between the leader and the electorate, when he addresses directly every person and just reporting and explaining his action or explaining why they failed or whatever, but sort of talking, connecting this bondage, this link, this psychological rapport, if you wish. And that creates this specific, again, the algorithm of power, these feedback loops when the leader makes some claim and then checking by sociological polls and also feedbacks on social media, whether it works or not. And that creates the whole system, how to keep this sort of high ratings, to keep the approval rate of the electorate. Conclusions. So if this hypothesis is correct, that Ukrainian politics is mostly performative, then I would say that the political domain in Ukraine, in the nearest future at least, will remain highly volatile, open to all sorts of turbulence, not only due to some objective external circumstances, but also by the very essence of performative politics. If it does not have this buffer of working institution, if it's always actor-centered and action-based, then it's always highly volatile. Some modes of political performativity gain traction in Ukraine. I gave them these Greek names, but what I mean in action that they are focused on different modes. One of them would be it's about sort of practicing, trying to embody virtues, which was like the key type of performativity on the Maidan, which got dubbed the revolution of dignity. So it was sort of practicing, embodying and exposing how some virtues, not just like holding them dear to my heart, but by acting in accordance to them and showing by my actions how I envision how it should work in practice. The other one would be mimetic, about imitating the electorate, the audience, and also other successful templates. That was the first stage of Zelensky political project, because he was trying to play sort of on two levels. On one hand, as I mentioned before, he was trying to stylistically imitate the electorate, I'm one of you, but also he's trying to mimic successful by his standard templates, and I would think that it would be Trudeau and Macron for him in the first instance. And the third mode of performativity would be technoperformativity. play out an efficient actor, right? Sort of targeting this pragmatic value of delivery. Maybe not delivering in real life, but at least acting as if I am as an actor, an official doer, and I'm delivering on my promises. That would be the latest stage of Zelensky argument. So to wrap up my last concluding remarks, achievements. If this sort of brief outlook on the unfolding political performativity in the recent history of Ukraine. So what are the achievements? The first one, indeed, is expanded agency for citizens, which never became yet hopefully fully fledged citizens, but still was recognized as keeping some political power, at least the veto power, at least a factor to be accounted for in any intra-elite negotiations. Secondly, interestingly, it was performing nationhood. Ukraine's agency as a country was recognized on the political, on the geopolitical domain, which was often referred to by external observers that Ukraine was put on the map, quote unquote, for the international audience. And the third achievement that I keep underlying is this marginal but yet quite efficient model of grassroots problem solving, which contains a germ for an alternative political configuration beyond the performative politics. What are the dangers? The drawbacks and dangers. I'm singling out two, the most crucial from my perspective. The first one, the social and economic tasks are systematically missed out. The improvement of the quality of life remains a hugely desired by all the sociological polls, but yet unfulfilled task. And that means that searches for new arrangements and models will most likely follow. And the second one is the absence of strategic thinking and long-term agenda setting, but instead following feedback loops with the electorate, which creates very fragile prospects of the country's future. And I will stop here. Thank you.